Hollywood does not forget its victories. It celebrates them forever. But what about the films that swallowed $50 million or more and then quietly disappeared from conversation? These were not small experiments. They were franchise dreams, reboots, prestige adaptations, animated epics. Somewhere between ambition and audience reality, something fractured. Tonight we examine 10 massive investments that studios rarely mention again, and the psychology behind why they failed. Alice Through the Looking Glass, 2016. There are flops, and then there are films that arrive wearing confidence like a crown and leave quietly through a side door. Alice Through the Looking Glass was meant to extend the strange, colorful universe that Disney rebuilt in 2010. The first film made over $1 billion worldwide, and expectations were enormous. The sequel carried a reported production budget of around $170 million. Marketing likely pushed the total investment well beyond $250 million. This time the story shifts away from Tim Burton's direction and places Alice back in Wonderland, where time itself becomes the enemy. The Mad Hatter is fading. The solution is impossible. Alice must travel backward through time to repair fractured memories and broken destinies. The film leans heavily on visual spectacle. Palaces fold like clockwork machines. Oceans solidify. Massive chessboard landscapes glow under impossible skies. But something felt different. Audiences sensed it. Critics noted it. The film lacked the unpredictable energy that made the first one a global event. It's Johnny Depp's personal controversies were dominating headlines during release. Fatigue had also begun creeping into fantasy reboots. What once felt bold now felt manufactured. Box office numbers told the real story. Worldwide gross stopped around $299 million. That may sound impressive. It was not enough. After theater splits and marketing costs, the studio absorbed heavy losses, estimated between $70 and $100 million. Disney did not formally bury the film, but notice what happened next. No third installment, no continuation. The Wonderland universe quietly dissolved from development plans. Merchandising slowed. The cultural footprint faded faster than expected. The lesson was not just financial, it revealed a shift in audience psychology. Spectacle alone no longer guaranteed loyalty. Emotional investment mattered more than digital wonder. This was not an artistic disaster, it was a strategic one. The sequel misunderstood what made the original resonate. It expanded scale instead of deepening stakes. And yet this was only the beginning of our descent, because the next entry was not just a sequel misfire, it was a franchise collapse, and it changed superhero cinema overnight. Dark Phoenix, 2019. Superhero films were supposed to be invincible. By the late 2010s, the genre had become a financial fortress. Audiences showed up almost automatically. Studios treated comic book properties like guaranteed insurance policies. Then Dark Phoenix arrived and exposed how fragile that illusion really was. This film carried the weight of an entire cinematic era. It was the final chapter of the long-running X-Men saga that began in 2000. Production budget estimates range between $190 and $200 million. Marketing likely pushed the total exposure far higher. Expectations were massive. The story adapts one of Marvel's most iconic arcs. Jean Grey absorbs cosmic energy during a space rescue mission. The power amplifies her abilities beyond control. Her personality fractures. Friends become enemies. The team that once protected humanity must confront one of their own. On paper, this should have been explosive drama. The Dark Phoenix storyline had been considered untouchable material for years. It demanded emotional devastation. Instead, the film felt restrained. Rewrites and reshoots altered the original ending. Corporate uncertainty loomed after Disney acquired Fox. The creative direction shifted midstream. Audiences sensed the instability. Opening weekend numbers were weak. Critical reception was colder than expected. Word of mouth never ignited. Worldwide gross stalled at roughly $252 million. After accounting for production and global marketing costs, industry analysts estimated losses exceeding $100 million. But the financial damage was only part of the story. Dark Phoenix marked the effective end of the Fox X-Men timeline. Plans for spin-offs dissolved. Future sequels vanished. Characters that once defined superhero cinema faded into transition, while Marvel Studios prepared to reboot them under a new banner. There was a psychological undertone to this failure. Superhero fatigue had not fully set in, but audiences were becoming selective. With emotional authenticity now mattered more than spectacle. This film tried to compress an epic tragedy into conventional franchise pacing. The result felt hollow. Studios rarely admit erasure. They simply move forward as if the misstep never happened. That is exactly what occurred here. Within months, conversation shifted toward the Marvel Cinematic Universe future. Dark Phoenix became a footnote rather than a finale. And if you think that was dramatic, the next entry was even more painful, because this one was meant to revive an action icon. Instead, it froze the franchise in place. Terminator Dark Fate, 2019. Some franchises refused to die. The Terminator series had already survived multiple timelines and creative reinventions. Dark Fate was positioned as a hard reset. It ignored several previous sequels and reunited Linda Hamilton and Arnold Schwarzenegger for the first time since the early 90s. The message was clear. This was the real continuation. The reported production budget hovered between $185 and $196 million. Global marketing likely pushed the total financial exposure beyond $300 million. The stakes were enormous. The film opens with a shock. A young John Connor is killed. The prophecy is dismantled immediately. Years later, a new artificial intelligence called Legion rises. A new protector arrives. A new savior emerges. The structure mirrors the original template, yet attempts to modernize it through fresh characters and political undertones. Director Tim Miller delivered polished action sequences. An industrial violence roared across highways and dam structures. Visual effects were seamless. The returning cast carried emotional weight. Linda Hamilton's performance was fierce and grounded, yet something did not connect. Audiences were divided over the opening decision. Franchise fatigue lingered after earlier installments disappointed. Younger viewers lacked emotional attachment to the brand. International markets underperformed expectations. When box office numbers stabilized, the global gross reached approximately $261 million. After distribution splits and expenses, the estimated loss exceeded $120 million. The consequences were immediate. Plans for a new trilogy evaporated. Studio executives quietly stepped back from large-scale theatrical continuations. If for a property once considered foundational, science fiction mythology, this was a dramatic retreat. Dark Fate was not incompetent filmmaking. It was an identity crisis. The film attempted to honor nostalgia while rebuilding relevance. That balancing act rarely works when audience trust has already eroded. Financial damage also exposed another truth. Legacy sequels depend on emotional continuity. Reboots demand clarity. Dark Fate tried to do both at once. Studios do not publicly erase their icons, but they allow silence to swallow them. After release, there was no grand announcement of cancellation, only absence. The next disaster was louder. Because it did not merely stall a franchise, it shattered a superhero launch before it truly began. Green Lantern, 2011. Much before cinematic universes became strategic blueprints, they were risky experiments. Green Lantern was Warner Brothers' attempt to launch a new pillar beside Batman and Superman. The character carried decades of comic mythology, intergalactic law enforcement, power rings fueled by will, vast alien civilizations. It was ambitious material. The production budget reportedly climbed above $200 million. Visual effects alone consumed massive resources. Marketing added another layer of financial pressure. This was meant to begin a franchise that could rival Marvel's growing dominance. The story follows test pilot Hal Jordan, who is chosen by a dying alien guardian to join the Green Lantern Corps. The ring grants him the ability to manifest constructs powered by imagination. But he must confront a cosmic entity named Parallax that feeds on fear. Conceptually, it offered scale and wonder. Entire alien cities were rendered in digital landscapes. The core felt expansive. The mythology was intact, yet execution faltered. Tone shifted between grounded drama and broad comedy. The computer-generated suit worn by Ryan Reynolds became a lightning rod for criticism. Villain design felt abstract rather than threatening. Emotional stakes never fully anchored the spectacle. Opening weekend numbers were respectable but not explosive. Word of mouth cooled rapidly. Domestic box office declined sharply in following weeks. Worldwide gross reached roughly $219 million. Against its enormous cost, analysts estimated losses between $75 and $150 million, depending on accounting models. The impact was severe. Warner Brothers halted immediate sequel plans. The intended interconnected universe stalled. It would take years before the studio attempted a unified DC strategy again. Culturally, the film became shorthand for superhero miscalculation. Even Ryan Reynolds later joked about the experience. When a studio and its lead actor publicly distance themselves from a project that signals more than financial disappointment, it signals reputational damage. Green Lantern was not devoid of ambition. It simply arrived before the formula was refined. Marvel had already begun establishing consistent tonal identity. Warner was still experimenting. The film was not erased from existence, but it was quietly sidelined. Future DC projects avoided referencing it. The character vanished from immediate cinematic plans. And yet this failure was not the most spectacular of our list, because the next one carried the weight of an American legend, and it fell harder than anyone predicted. The Lone Ranger, 2013. When a studio spends more than $200 million, it does not expect silence. The Lone Ranger was designed as a summer event. It reunited director Gore Verbinski with Johnny Depp after the Pirates franchise minted billions. The ambition was enormous. Production costs reportedly reached around $215 million. Marketing pushed the total exposure toward $350 million or more. The premise revived a classic American hero. Armie Hammer plays John Reed, who survives a massacre and becomes a masked vigilante. Johnny Depp portrays Tonto as both narrator and spiritual counterweight. The film blends revenge western with eccentric humor and large-scale action. Trains explode across desert bridges. Cavalry battles unfold in sweeping landscapes. The finale builds toward an extended railroad sequence, staged with operatic intensity. The scale was undeniable. So was the risk. From early production, the budget ballooned. Delays and rewrites added strain. Public debate over cultural representation of Tonto complicated reception before release. Tone became a central issue. The film shifted between earnest frontier drama and self-aware comedy. Audiences struggled to understand what it wanted to be. Opening numbers disappointed. Domestic performance softened quickly. How no international markets failed to compensate. Worldwide gross reached roughly $260 million. After distribution cuts and promotional expenses, analysts estimated studio losses exceeding $150 million. But the financial loss was only part of the wound. Disney had intended The Lone Ranger to launch a long-term franchise. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about inflated spectacle and tonal confusion. Future plans for sequels vanished. Western epics at blockbuster scale became rarer. Executives reconsidered how much nostalgia alone could justify investment. The film itself contains moments of bold craftsmanship. The climactic train sequence remains technically impressive. Hans Zimmer's score reinterprets classic themes with intensity. Yet audiences did not connect emotionally with its characters. This was not a small misfire. It was a public stumble. Studios rarely admit that certain projects reshape strategy. But after this release, Disney grew more cautious about expensive original tentpoles outside established brands. The Lone Ranger was not deleted from archives. It was simply not discussed again in franchise conversations. Its silence spoke louder than any press release. And if that felt dramatic, the next disaster attempted to resurrect one of cinema's most sacred epics, and audiences turned away. Ben-Hur, 2016. There are films that fail quietly, and then there are remakes that challenge sacred ground. Ben-Hur was one of those risks. The original 1959 epic is still considered one of the most celebrated films in Hollywood history. 11 Academy Awards, monumental scale, cultural permanence. And to remake it required confidence bordering on audacity. The 2016 version carried a reported production budget of around $100 million. Marketing likely elevated the total cost far beyond that. The studio positioned it as a spiritual action drama that could blend biblical themes with modern pacing. The story remains familiar. Judah Ben-Hur is betrayed by his adopted Roman brother Messala. He is condemned to slavery. His family is imprisoned. Years of suffering harden him into a man driven by vengeance. The emotional center builds toward the legendary chariot race an eventual confrontation between revenge and redemption. Director Timur Bekmambetov attempted to modernize the spectacle. The chariot sequence was staged with dynamic camera movement and practical stunts. Not Morgan Freeman portrayed a fictionalized mentor figure who trains Judah for the race. The production aimed for intensity rather than slow classical grandeur. But audiences did not respond. Opening weekend was underwhelming. Critics questioned the necessity of remaking such a revered classic. Comparisons were inevitable and rarely favorable. Younger viewers lacked emotional investment in the property. Older audiences felt the remake could not justify its existence. Worldwide gross stopped at approximately $94 million. That figure fell below its reported production budget alone. Analysts estimated losses between $50 and $100 million after accounting for marketing and distribution expenses. This was not merely a box office disappointment, it exposed the limits of nostalgia-driven remakes. Number prestige alone cannot guarantee relevance. Epic scale without fresh emotional urgency struggles to resonate. Studios often move forward without announcing retreat. In this case, there were no sequel discussions, no extended universe concepts. The property returned to dormancy. Ben-Hur was not erased. It simply faded. Its silence demonstrated a hard truth. Some legends resist reinvention. Audiences can sense when a story is being revived for strategic reasons rather than creative necessity. And yet the next entry was not a remake of prestige cinema. It was a gamble on horror mythology. And the gamble did not pay off. Hellboy, 2019. Reboots are promises. They tell audiences that this time it will be different. Darker, more faithful, more intense. Hellboy arrived carrying that exact promise. Guillermo del Toro's earlier films had built a loyal following in the early 2000s. They were stylized and melancholic. When the studio chose to reboot the property with a harder edge, many fans were cautious but curious. Production budget estimates circled around $50 million. Marketing added further strain, though not at blockbuster scale. This version follows the same core premise. A demon summoned to Earth during World War II is raised by a human professor and grows into a paranormal investigator. Hellboy must confront the Blood Queen, who seeks to reclaim ancient dominion over humanity. The film leans heavily into graphic violence and mythic horror. Folklore creatures appear grotesque and raw. The tone is unapologetically brutal. David Harbour stepped into the title role with visible commitment. And the practical makeup remained impressive. Certain creature designs honored the comic source material closely, but something fractured. Reviews were sharply negative. Critics described uneven pacing and tonal chaos. Audiences who cherished the earlier films resisted the stylistic departure. New viewers were unsure where this iteration fit within the larger superhero landscape. Opening weekend numbers were weak. Domestic performance collapsed quickly. Worldwide gross reached roughly $55 million. Against its production and marketing costs, analysts concluded the film generated significant losses, though smaller in scale than blockbuster disasters. The deeper impact was symbolic. Hellboy was intended to launch a new series grounded in darker fantasy. Those plans dissolved immediately. And within weeks of release, studio conversations pivoted elsewhere. The franchise returned to uncertainty. This failure highlighted a delicate balance in reboot culture. Faithfulness to source material does not guarantee cinematic cohesion. Intensifying tone does not automatically translate into audience engagement. The film attempted to distance itself from the prior interpretation, yet could not establish a clear new identity. Studios rarely admit abandonment. They simply stop speaking about sequels. Hellboy joined that quiet space where potential once lived. And now we enter the upper tier of this countdown, because the next disaster was not modest in scale. It was an animated epic from one of the most powerful studios on Earth, and even that could not prevent collapse. Strange World, 2022. When Disney releases an original animated feature, the industry watches carefully. For decades, the studio built its identity on spectacle and emotional storytelling. Strange World was positioned as a bold new adventure, a science fiction family epic inspired by pulp exploration tales. The reported production budget approached $180 million. Marketing added significant additional exposure. The story follows the Clade family of explorers. Searcher Clade discovers a powerful plant that fuels their society. Years later, the energy source begins to fail. Three generations venture into an uncharted subterranean ecosystem to save their world. Strange creatures roam bioluminescent landscapes. The environment feels organic and alien at once. Visually, the film was inventive. And the animation department constructed a vibrant world filled with imaginative detail. Character design embraced warmth and diversity. Thematically, it explored generational tension and environmental responsibility. Yet something went wrong. Marketing lacked clarity. The premise was difficult to summarize in a single sentence. Holiday competition was intense. Audience turnout remained soft from opening weekend onward. International performance was particularly weak. Worldwide box office stalled around $73 million. Against its high production and promotional costs, analysts estimated losses between $100 and $190 million, depending on accounting projections. This was not a small miscalculation. It was one of Disney's largest animation losses in modern history. Much of the consequences were subtle but telling. The studio reassessed theatrical strategy for original animation. Future releases shifted toward streaming or hybrid models. Conversation quickly pivoted toward established franchises rather than fresh concepts. Strange World did not lack craft, it lacked traction. Audience psychology had shifted. Brand recognition now carried more weight than originality at scale. Animated films tied to familiar properties felt safer to families navigating rising ticket prices. Disney did not disown the film, but it did not champion it either. Merchandise presence diminished rapidly. Cultural discussion faded within months. This was a reminder that even industry giants are not immune to audience hesitation. And now we approach the final two entries. The next one carried feline ambition in digital experimentation. Instead, it became a punchline. Cats, 2019. Sometimes disaster arrives wrapped in prestige. Cats was not conceived as a risk. It was based on one of the most successful stage musicals of all time. Andrew Lloyd Webber's production ran for decades and earned billions in global revenue. Universal Pictures believed cinematic translation would extend that legacy. The reported production budget reached roughly $95 million. Marketing and distribution costs raised the financial stakes considerably. The premise is deceptively simple. A tribe of jellicle cats gathers for an annual ritual where one will ascend to a new life. Each character introduces themselves through song. There is no conventional narrative arc in the theatrical version. The film adaptation attempted to weave connective tissue between musical numbers. Director Tom Hooper chose an experimental visual approach. Actors were digitally transformed into human-feline hybrids using motion capture and computer-generated fur. The ambition was technical innovation. The result unsettled many viewers. Early trailers triggered widespread online reaction. Audiences described the characters as uncanny. The studio made last-minute visual adjustments, even after theatrical release. That alone signaled instability. Critical reception was severe. Reviews questioned tonal coherence and narrative clarity. Performances varied in energy. Musical sequences struggled to replicate the intimacy of live theater. Opening weekend numbers were modest. Word of mouth turned sharply negative. Worldwide box office concluded around $75 million. When production and global marketing costs were factored in, analysts estimated losses exceeding $100 million. But financial impact was only one layer. Cats became a cultural phenomenon for unintended reasons. Late-night hosts referenced it. Social media amplified its visual strangeness. Instead of prestige, it achieved notoriety. Universal did not publicly disown the film, yet plans for similar large-scale musical experiments cooled. The studio recalibrated how theatrical musicals might translate into digital spectacle. There is a lesson here about adaptation. Theater operates through suggestion. Cinema demands illusion that withstands close scrutiny. When that illusion fractures, audience immersion collapses. Cats was ambitious, it was earnest. It was also misaligned with audience expectation. And now we arrive at the top. The number one entry was supposed to launch a fantasy franchise. Instead, it vanished into box office history. Pan, 2015. At the top of our countdown sits a film that was engineered as a beginning. Pan was not intended as a standalone curiosity. Warner Bros. Envisioned it as the foundation of a new fantasy franchise. The production budget reportedly reached around $150 million. Marketing and global distribution elevated the total financial exposure toward $250 million or more. The film reimagines the origin of Peter Pan. Instead of arriving in Neverland as a carefree boy, he begins in a London orphanage during World War II. And he is abducted by flying pirate ships and transported to a mineral-rich island ruled by Blackbeard. Hugh Jackman portrays the flamboyant pirate overlord who enslaves children to mine magical pixie dust. A young Peter forms alliances with James Hook before their rivalry takes shape. Director Joe Wright infused the story with stylized ambition. The pirate introduction sequence unfolds with theatrical bravado. Visual effects paint Neverland in saturated color. Tribal warriors clash with corsair fleets. The narrative attempts to fuse myth with steampunk spectacle. Yet something felt uncertain. Critics questioned tonal shifts between child-friendly adventure and darker industrial imagery. Some casting choices sparked controversy. The reinterpretation of familiar characters confused audiences expecting a more traditional fairy tale. Marketing struggled to define whether this was whimsical fantasy or grand epic. Opening weekend numbers were soft. Competition was fierce. International performance failed to compensate for domestic weakness. Worldwide gross concluded near $128 million. Against its towering production and marketing costs, analysts estimated losses ranging between $80 and $150 million, depending on calculations. The fallout was swift. Franchise aspirations evaporated. Planned sequels were shelved almost immediately. Warner Brothers redirected resources toward more reliable intellectual properties. The studio did not attempt another large-scale Peter Pan reinvention for years. Pan illustrates a precise industry truth. Reinventing beloved mythology demands clarity of tone. An audiences approach familiar stories with deeply ingrained expectations. When reinterpretation drifts too far without emotional grounding, the reaction becomes cautious rather than curious. The film was not devoid of imagination. It simply lacked resonance. And that completes our descent through 10 ambitious projects that carried enormous budgets and even greater expectations. Not every disaster is loud. Some fade with a whisper while accountants close the books. These films remind us that spectacle does not guarantee survival. Audiences decide legacy. Studios adjust silently. And somewhere in Hollywood vaults, these $50 million gambles still wait for a second chance.